Early January 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final phase. Victory seemed inevitable. But inside Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Dwight Eisenhower sat at his desk staring at a problem that could destroy everything they had fought for. His British Field Marshal had just committed what some were calling an act of treason. Not against the Germans, against the Americans. Bernard Montgomery had stood before a room full of reporters and claimed he personally saved the American army during the Battle of the Bulge. He described finding American forces in complete disarray. He painted a picture of panicked American generals who had lost control of their troops. He positioned himself as the brilliant British commander who rode in to organize the defense and stop the Germans. The reaction across the Atlantic was volcanic. American newspapers exploded with rage. Veterans organizations demanded Montgomery be stripped of his command. Most dangerously, General Omar Bradley walked into Eisenhower's office and delivered an ultimatum that would change the course of the war. Bradley told Eisenhower he would resign. Not just resign. He would walk away from the war entirely rather than continue serving under a command structure that allowed such insults to American soldiers. Bradley was not alone. Other American generals supported him. George Patton heard about Montgomery's press conference and told Bradley he would resign alongside him. Patton's Third Army had saved Bastogne during the Bulge. His forces had stopped the German offensive from the south, while Montgomery was supposedly organizing the northern defense. For Patton, this was the final insult from a man he had despised for years. Now think about what Eisenhower was facing. He was the supreme Allied commander. His job was to defeat Nazi Germany. But if Bradley and Patton resigned, the American command structure would collapse. Other generals would follow. The alliance between America and Britain would fracture. The war in Europe would be jeopardized, not because of German military strength, but because one British field marshal couldn't control his ego. Eisenhower couldn't fire Montgomery without destroying the alliance with Britain. Churchill would never accept it. British public opinion would explode. The political consequences would be catastrophic. But Eisenhower also couldn't let Montgomery continue insulting American soldiers and stealing credit for American victories. His own generals were ready to mutiny. The men who had fought across France were threatening to walk away from the war. Eisenhower needed a solution that would satisfy no one, but might keep everyone fighting. He needed to punish Montgomery without firing him. He needed to restore American pride without humiliating Britain. He needed to keep the alliance together while the Third Reich was still fighting. And he had about 48 hours to figure it out before the entire Western coalition fell apart. Before we get into how Eisenhower solved this crisis, let me ask you something. Have you ever heard this story? Most World War II content focuses on battles and military operations. But this crisis almost ended the war before Germany surrendered. This is the story of how one press conference nearly destroyed the alliance, how American generals threatened mass resignation, and how Eisenhower orchestrated one of the most brilliant political maneuvers of the entire war. If you want to hear stories from World War II that nobody talks about, hit that subscribe button right now because this channel digs into the forgotten moments that changed history. Let's go back to January 7, 1945, Montgomery's press conference. To understand why this was so explosive, you need to understand what actually happened during the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. Hitler threw everything he had left at the weakest point in the American line. The goal was to split the Allied forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The German offensive created chaos. American units were surrounded. Communications broke down. The front line fractured. Eisenhower made a command decision. The German attack had split the American front into northern and southern sectors. Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg was too far south to effectively coordinate the northern defense. Montgomery's headquarters was closer. Eisenhower temporarily placed two American armies under Montgomery's command. The First Army under General Courtney Hodges and the Ninth Army under General William Simpson. Combined, over 500,000 American soldiers. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, just until the crisis passed, just until the front stabilized. Montgomery would coordinate the northern defense while Bradley handled the southern sector. That was the plan. Now, here's what actually happened during the Battle of the Bulge. American soldiers fought like hell. They held critical road junctions. They defended Bastogne against impossible odds. They stopped the German advance through sheer determination and sacrifice. Patton's Third Army executed one of the most brilliant maneuvers of the war, turning 90 degrees north in the middle of winter and relieving Bastogne in just days. American generals coordinated the defense. American troops did the fighting. American blood soaked into the Ardennes snow. 19,000 Americans died in those woods. Montgomery's role was coordination. He helped organize the northern defense. His staff contributed to planning. British troops fought in some sectors. But Montgomery did not save the American army. American soldiers saved themselves. So when Montgomery stood before reporters on January 7th and claimed he had personally rescued the Americans from disaster, it was not just inaccurate. It was a betrayal. Montgomery described finding American forces in complete disorder. He talked about how he organized the defense. He made it sound like American generals had panicked and British leadership had stepped in to save the day. The implication was clear. Without Montgomery, the Americans would have been destroyed. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. American newspapers published the story with headlines like, "Montgomery claims credit for American victory." Radio broadcasts discussed Montgomery's statements. Veterans organizations released statements demanding explanations. But the real crisis was happening inside the command structure. General Omar Bradley read the reports and felt something inside him break. Bradley was not a dramatic man. He was calm, professional, methodical. He avoided conflicts when possible. But Montgomery's press conference crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Bradley had commanded American forces since Normandy. He had planned the breakout from the beaches. He had overseen the liberation of France. His armies had fought across Europe for months. During the Bulge, Eisenhower had temporarily placed Bradley's armies under Montgomery's command for operational reasons. Bradley had accepted this because the situation required it. But it was supposed to be temporary. Now Montgomery was claiming he had saved Bradley's armies. Worse, Montgomery was implying that American generals were incompetent, that American soldiers needed British leadership to succeed, that without Montgomery, the Battle of the Bulge would have been an American disaster. Bradley went to Eisenhower's office and delivered his ultimatum. If Montgomery retained any permanent command over American forces, Bradley would resign. He would not serve as an Army Group commander without armies to command. He would not watch Montgomery use American troops to pursue British strategic objectives while taking credit for American victories. He would not accept a command structure that treated American generals as subordinate to British field marshals. Bradley's position was firm, and it was final. When Patton heard about Montgomery's press conference, his reaction was even more explosive. Patton had despised Montgomery for years. He viewed him as a cautious, self-promoting politician in a general's uniform. Montgomery's failure at Operation Market Garden in September 1944 had confirmed everything Patton believed about British military leadership. Now Montgomery was claiming credit for the Battle of the Bulge, while Patton's Third Army had done the actual fighting in the South. Patton told Bradley he would resign alongside him. Not as a gesture, not as a threat to gain leverage, Patton genuinely believed that serving under Montgomery's authority would be a betrayal of the American soldiers who had died in the Ardennes. Other American commanders expressed similar sentiments. The threat was real. If Bradley and Patton resigned, other generals would follow. The American command structure in Europe would collapse. Eisenhower would lose the generals who had fought the war from D-Day to the German border. The United States Army would be in chaos. Victory over Germany would be delayed. American public opinion would explode. Congress would demand investigations. The political consequences would destroy careers and possibly governments. Eisenhower understood exactly what he was facing. This was not a military problem. This was a political crisis that could end his career and jeopardize the alliance that had defeated Hitler. Now, here's where Montgomery made everything worse. Instead of apologizing immediately, Montgomery seemed genuinely confused about why Americans were upset. From his perspective, he had simply stated facts. He had coordinated the Northern defense. He had organized American forces. British planning had helped stabilize the situation. What was inaccurate about that? Montgomery's chief of staff, Major General Freddie de Guingand, understood the crisis better than Montgomery did. De Guingand flew to Eisenhower's headquarters to assess the situation. What he learned shocked him. Eisenhower had drafted orders relieving Montgomery of command. Montgomery was hours away from being fired. The orders were ready. Eisenhower was waiting for final approval from the combined chiefs of staff. If those orders went out, Montgomery's career was over. Britain's role in the final victory would be dramatically reduced. The alliance would be damaged permanently. De Guingand flew back to Montgomery and told him the truth. "You are about to be fired. Your career is over. The Americans are ready to finish this war without you. You need to apologize immediately, or you will lose everything." Montgomery was stunned. He genuinely had not understood how his press conference would be received. He thought he was simply explaining his role in the battle. The idea that he might be fired had never occurred to him. De Guingand forced Montgomery to write an apology. On January 8th, Montgomery sent a message to Eisenhower expressing regret for any misunderstanding his press conference had caused. He praised the fighting qualities of American soldiers. He acknowledged the sacrifices they had made. He clarified that his intent had been to explain operational coordination, not to diminish American achievements. The apology was carefully worded. It expressed regret without admitting error. It praised Americans without retracting Montgomery's description of events. It was a political document designed to diffuse the crisis without humbling Montgomery completely. The apology worked in one sense. It prevented Montgomery from being fired. Eisenhower accepted the apology publicly. The immediate crisis of Montgomery's dismissal was avoided, but the apology did nothing to restore trust. Bradley still wanted Montgomery removed from any authority over American forces. Patton still viewed Montgomery with contempt. American soldiers still felt betrayed by a commander who had stolen credit for their sacrifices. The fundamental problem remained unresolved. Montgomery commanded 2 American armies, totaling over 500,000 soldiers. That arrangement had been temporary during the Bulge. But the Bulge was over. The German offensive had been stopped. The front had stabilized. There was no operational reason for Montgomery to continue commanding American forces, except Montgomery wanted to keep them. 2 days after his apology, Montgomery walked into another meeting with Eisenhower. This time he came with a formal proposal. Keep 1st Army and 9th Army under his command permanently. Use those forces to launch a concentrated offensive in the north. Drive through the Ruhr industrial region. End the war by May. Montgomery argued military logic. Eisenhower's broad front strategy was wasting resources. American armies in the South under Patton were making limited progress. Everything should be concentrated for one massive thrust under unified command in the North. Montgomery needed both American armies for his plan to work. British forces were exhausted after 5 years of war. Canadian forces were under strength. American manpower was essential for breakthrough operations. Taking these armies away would doom the northern offensive. The Germans were weakest in the north. One concentrated thrust would break through and end the war quickly. Dispersing forces across a broad front would prolong the war unnecessarily. Montgomery presented his case with absolute confidence. He believed his plan was militarily superior. He believed history would prove him right. He believed Eisenhower was making a strategic mistake by refusing to concentrate forces in the North. Eisenhower listened without interrupting. He let Montgomery make his complete argument. He asked clarifying questions about logistics and timing. He reviewed Montgomery's operational plans. Then Eisenhower gave his answer. No, the command arrangement during the Bulge had always been temporary. First Army and Ninth Army would return to American command. The decision was final. Montgomery's face went cold. He argued that this would doom his offensive. Eisenhower was making a military mistake for political reasons. The war would be prolonged because American generals were too proud to accept British command. History would judge this decision as the moment when political considerations outweighed military logic. Eisenhower did not respond to Montgomery's arguments. He simply repeated that the decision was final. The armies would return to American command. The meeting was over. Now here's what was really happening behind the scenes. Winston Churchill was watching this crisis unfold with growing alarm. Churchill understood the stakes better than Montgomery did. Britain had been fighting Germany since 1939. 6 years of war had exhausted British resources. British manpower was depleted. The British economy was bankrupt. Britain needed American strength to win the war. But Britain also needed to maintain influence over Allied strategy. If Montgomery lost command of all American forces, British influence over the final offensive into Germany would end. The victory would be entirely American. Britain would be reduced to a supporting role in its own continent. Churchill could not allow that. But Churchill also understood that Montgomery had created an impossible situation. American generals were ready to resign. American public opinion was furious. Congress was asking questions. The political cost of defending Montgomery was too high. Churchill needed a compromise, something that would maintain British strategic relevance without triggering mass resignations of American commanders. He called Eisenhower and proposed a middle path. Let Montgomery keep the Ninth Army, but return First Army to Bradley immediately. This would give Montgomery enough American strength for the Rhine crossing while returning most forces to American command. It would maintain British participation in the final offensive without requiring American generals to accept permanent British authority. It would preserve the alliance while addressing American concerns. Eisenhower saw the logic immediately. Bradley would get First Army back. That was his largest army and his most important command. Montgomery would keep enough American strength to execute a significant operation. The compromise would satisfy no one completely, but it might keep everyone in the war. But Eisenhower added a critical restriction that Churchill had not specified. Montgomery could keep Ninth Army, but only temporarily, only for the Rhine crossing operation. After the Rhine was crossed, Ninth Army would also return to American command. This was not negotiable. Montgomery would command Ninth Army for Operation Plunder and nothing more. No permanent command. No continued authority after the operation. One army for one specific mission. When Eisenhower presented this compromise to Montgomery, the British Field Marshal understood exactly what was being offered. Accept this reduced compromise, or lose both armies immediately. Keep one army temporarily, or command only British and Canadian forces for the rest of the war. He accepted, because he had no choice. On January 17, 1945, First Army officially returned to Bradley's 12th Army Group. General Hodges now reported to Bradley, not Montgomery. The command structure returned to what it had been before the Bulge. Bradley was satisfied with this part of the compromise. He got his largest army back. Montgomery's authority over American forces was reduced to one army for one operation. The precedent that American armies would be commanded by Americans was re-established. But Bradley was not satisfied with Montgomery keeping 9th Army even temporarily. He told Eisenhower to watch Montgomery carefully. Bradley believed Montgomery would use the Rhine crossing to argue for extended command. He believed Montgomery would find reasons to delay returning the army. He believed this compromise was just the beginning of another fight. Eisenhower told Bradley the decision was made. Montgomery needed 9th Army for the Rhine crossing. After that operation, the army would return. Period. But Bradley's concerns proved prophetic. Montgomery spent February and March planning Operation Plunder, the assault across the Rhine. This would be the largest river crossing of the war. Massive artillery bombardment. 2 airborne divisions dropped behind German lines. Meticulous preparation for every contingency. Montgomery's strength was preparing set-piece operations where nothing was left to chance. 9th Army would be the southern prong of the attack. General Simpson and his staff worked closely with Montgomery's headquarters. Simpson respected Montgomery's organizational skills and thoroughness. The planning was meticulous and professional. But 9th Army officers noticed something troubling. Montgomery's staff talked about operations beyond the Rhine as if 9th Army would remain under British command permanently. Plans for advancing into northern Germany included 9th Army forces without any mention of the Army returning to American command after the crossing. The operational documents treated 9th Army as a permanent fixture of British 21st Army Group. When Simpson's staff raised questions, Montgomery's staff responded that such details would be worked out later. The focus now was on crossing the Rhine successfully. Everything else was secondary. Simpson reported these concerns to Bradley. Bradley reported them to Eisenhower. Eisenhower said he would handle it after the Rhine was crossed. For now, the priority was executing the operation successfully. But everyone understood what was happening. Montgomery was setting the stage to argue for keeping 9th Army permanently. Then, on March 22, 1945, something happened that changed everything. George Patton's 3rd Army reached the Rhine near Oppenheim. Within hours, elements of 3rd Army were across the river. Patton called Bradley immediately with specific instructions. "Tell the world we're across. I want everyone to know 3rd Army made it before Montgomery starts his big show." Patton's crossing was opportunistic. He had not been planning a major Rhine crossing. His forces simply reached a weakly defended section of the river, and Patton ordered an immediate attack. No massive preparation, no elaborate planning, no months of logistics coordination, just rapid exploitation of German weakness. Patton got his forces across the Rhine with minimal casualties and immediately began expanding the bridgehead. This was more than a tactical victory. This was a demonstration of American operational doctrine. Mobile warfare, rapid exploitation, aggressive action when opportunities appeared. Patton had crossed the Rhine using American methods, and it had worked beautifully. Montgomery heard about Patton's crossing and was furious. This was typical American recklessness. The Rhine was a major military obstacle that required proper preparation. Patton had gotten lucky finding a weak spot. The real crossing would be Operation Plunder, where professional planning would ensure success. But Patton had proven something critically important. The Rhine could be crossed without Montgomery's elaborate preparations. American methods worked. The great river barrier that Montgomery had spent months preparing to assault had been breached by Patton in a matter of hours. The symbolism was devastating for Montgomery's argument that American forces needed British command to succeed. Operation Plunder launched on March 23rd, one day after Patton's crossing. Over 300,000 Allied troops participated. Ninth Army attacked from the southern sector. British and Canadian forces attacked from the north. Massive artillery support hammered German positions. Airborne divisions seized key positions behind enemy lines. Engineers constructed bridges under fire. The operation succeeded exactly as Montgomery had planned. His forces crossed the Rhine and established a substantial bridgehead. German resistance was heavy, but Allied strength was overwhelming. By March 25th, forces were advancing beyond the river into Germany. Montgomery declared the operation a complete success. Perfect execution. Professional planning, overcoming all obstacles. The northern route into Germany was now open, but American newspapers noted that Patton had crossed first with fewer casualties and less preparation. Operation Plunder was impressive, but it followed Patton's proof that the Rhine could be taken rapidly with American methods. The comparison was unavoidable and unflattering for Montgomery. Simpson's Ninth Army performed excellently during Operation Plunder. American troops had done much of the fighting. Montgomery praised their performance. He told his staff the army was essential for operations beyond the Rhine. Then Montgomery did exactly what Bradley had predicted. After the Rhine crossing, Montgomery's staff submitted operational plans for advancing into northern Germany. The plans included 9th Army forces as a permanent component of 21st Army Group. Montgomery argued to Eisenhower that removing 9th Army now would disrupt operations that were already underway. He claimed the Ruhr encirclement required continued unity of command. 9th Army was positioned perfectly to complete the encirclement from the south. Transferring the army to American command in the middle of active operations would be militarily foolish. Every operation led to another operation that supposedly required keeping 9th Army under British command. This was the scenario Bradley had warned about. Montgomery using operational necessity to extend his command indefinitely. Bradley went to Eisenhower and said the time had come. Montgomery had his Rhine crossing. The operation was successful. Now return the army as promised. No more delays. No more operational excuses. The agreement had been specific. One army for one operation. The operation was complete. Return the army. Eisenhower agreed. On April 4, 1945, 9th Army officially returned to Bradley's 12th Army Group. The transfer was immediate and final. Montgomery commanded only British and Canadian forces for the remainder of the war. Montgomery protested to Churchill. This decision would cripple his advance into northern Germany. 9th Army had been essential to every operation since the Rhine crossing. Taking it away now made no military sense. Operations that were underway would be disrupted. The momentum of the advance would be lost. Churchill did not intervene. The political cost of fighting this battle was too high. Britain's influence over Allied strategy had been declining since D-Day. American forces outnumbered British forces by huge margins. American logistics sustained the offensive. American industry provided the weapons. This was the final admission that the war would be won by American methods under American command. Britain's role as a major strategic player in the alliance was over. Simpson's 9th Army continued advancing into Germany under Bradley's direction. They drove deep into German territory. They linked up with Soviet forces at the Elbe River in late April. The army that Montgomery had desperately wanted to keep played its role in the final victory under American command. Montgomery's 21st Army Group advanced into northern Germany and the Netherlands, with only British and Canadian forces. They liberated Dutch cities. They captured German ports. They accepted surrender of German forces in their sector on May 4th. Montgomery commanded successfully, but he was commanding only Commonwealth forces. His vision of leading a massive Allied thrust to Berlin had died in January when Eisenhower took First Army away. The Rhine crossing with Ninth Army had been his final operation, commanding American troops. Now let's talk about what really happened here, because this story is about much more than command structures and operational plans. Eisenhower had orchestrated one of the most brilliant political maneuvers of the entire war. He couldn't fire Montgomery without destroying the alliance with Britain. He couldn't give Montgomery permanent command of American armies without losing his American generals. So he gave Montgomery exactly enough rope to hang himself. The compromise of keeping Ninth Army temporarily for the Rhine crossing served multiple purposes. It maintained British participation in a major operation. It prevented the alliance from fracturing over command politics. It satisfied Churchill's need to preserve British strategic relevance. But it also gave Eisenhower a perfect test of Montgomery's trustworthiness. Eisenhower bet that Montgomery would try to exploit the temporary arrangement. He bet that Montgomery would find operational reasons to keep Ninth Army permanently. He bet that Montgomery had learned nothing from his press conference disaster. And Eisenhower was right. Montgomery took the bait completely. He planned operations that assumed continued command of Ninth Army. He argued operational necessity when the Rhine crossing was complete. He did exactly what Bradley had predicted. And by doing so, Montgomery gave Eisenhower the justification to take Ninth Army away permanently. Eisenhower could point to Montgomery's broken promise. He could demonstrate that the temporary arrangement was being exploited. He could return Ninth Army to American command with complete political justification. Montgomery's attempt to keep the Army proved he could not be trusted with American forces. The compromise was not just a political bridge to keep the alliance together. It was a trap. And Montgomery walked right into it. There's a deeper lesson here about coalition warfare and trust. Montgomery destroyed the trust of American commanders with his January press conference. That single press conference, where he claimed credit for American victories, cost him everything. The apology prevented him from being fired immediately, but it did not restore trust. Bradley and Patton never trusted Montgomery again. When Eisenhower gave Montgomery Ninth Army for the Rhine crossing, American generals accepted it reluctantly. They knew it was temporary. They knew operations required some Allied coordination. But they watched Montgomery carefully because they did not trust him. And when Montgomery tried to keep Ninth Army permanently, he confirmed everything American generals believed about him. He was self-promoting. He was dishonest. He could not be trusted to honor agreements. He viewed American forces as resources for British strategic objectives. The loss of trust was irreversible. Once Bradley and Patton decided Montgomery could not be trusted, no amount of operational success could change their minds. Montgomery's careful planning and successful Rhine crossing meant nothing. His professional competence was irrelevant. He had broken trust, and in coalition warfare, trust is everything. Eisenhower understood this. His job as Supreme Allied Commander was not primarily military. It was political. He had to maintain the alliance while defeating Germany. He had to balance British and American interests. He had to keep Churchill happy while preventing his generals from resigning. The military operations were almost secondary to the political challenge of keeping the coalition together, and Eisenhower succeeded brilliantly. He gave Montgomery enough to maintain British participation without giving him enough to threaten American command authority. He let Montgomery prove his untrustworthiness rather than simply asserting it. He took Ninth Army away with complete political justification because Montgomery had violated the agreement. By the end, even Churchill could not defend Montgomery's position. The game was played at the highest levels of strategic leadership, and Montgomery lost completely. What's fascinating is that Montgomery never seemed to fully understand what had happened. From his perspective, he had been treated unfairly. His operational plans were sound. His strategic vision was correct. American political considerations had overruled military logic. He had been robbed of the forces necessary to end the war quickly. Montgomery wrote in his memoirs that Eisenhower's broad front strategy prolonged the war unnecessarily. He maintained that a concentrated thrust in the north under unified command would have reached Berlin before the Soviets. He believed history would vindicate his strategic vision. But Montgomery missed the point entirely. The problem was never his strategic plans. The problem was his complete inability to understand coalition politics. His January press conference revealed a man who viewed the alliance as a tool for personal glory rather than a partnership between nations. His attempt to keep Ninth Army permanently revealed a man who would break agreements when convenient. His entire approach to command revealed someone who fundamentally did not understand how to lead within a coalition structure. Eisenhower understood coalition leadership perfectly. He knew when to compromise and when to hold firm. He knew how to maintain relationships while pursuing strategic objectives. He knew that trust was more valuable than temporary operational advantages. Most importantly, he knew that the alliance would outlast any individual commander or any single operation. Think about what would have happened if Eisenhower had handled this differently. If he had fired Montgomery in January, the alliance would have fractured. British public opinion would have turned against American leadership. Churchill might have been forced to withdraw British forces from American command completely. The war would have continued with two separate Allied offensives that did not coordinate effectively. German forces could have exploited the divisions. Victory would have been delayed and more costly. If Eisenhower had given Montgomery permanent command of American armies, Bradley and Patton would have resigned. Other American generals would have followed. The American command structure would have collapsed. Congress would have demanded investigations. American public opinion would have turned against the entire alliance structure. The political consequences would have been catastrophic. Eisenhower found the narrow path between these disasters. He punished Montgomery without firing him. He restored American command authority without humiliating Britain. He maintained the alliance while protecting his relationships with American generals. And he did it all while keeping everyone focused on defeating Germany. That is leadership at the highest level. That is why Eisenhower was supreme Allied commander, while more operationally brilliant generals like Patton and Montgomery served under his authority. Eisenhower understood that winning the war required more than military genius. It required political skill, diplomatic finesse, and the ability to manage enormous egos without destroying the coalition. There's one more aspect of this story that deserves attention. Patton's Rhine crossing on March 22nd was not just a tactical victory. It was a demonstration that American operational methods worked. Montgomery had spent months arguing that major river crossings required elaborate preparation. He insisted that professional planning was necessary to ensure success. His approach to Operation Plunder reflected this philosophy. Months of preparation, massive logistics build-up, overwhelming force, every contingency planned, nothing left to chance. And Operation Plunder succeeded exactly as planned. But Patton proved that American methods also worked. Rapid exploitation of opportunities, aggressive action when openings appeared, mobile warfare that kept enemies off balance. Patton crossed the Rhine with minimal preparation and minimal casualties. His success validated American operational doctrine. The contrast between Patton and Montgomery represented two different approaches to warfare. Montgomery represented the set-piece battle, careful planning, overwhelming preparation, minimizing risk through thoroughness. This approach had worked at El Alamein. It had worked in Sicily. It reflected British military tradition and lessons learned over centuries of warfare. Patton represented mobile warfare, speed and aggression, exploiting enemy weaknesses, accepting risk in pursuit of operational advantages. This approach reflected American industrial strength and cultural preference for action over planning. Both approaches could succeed. But Patton's crossing before Montgomery's elaborate operation demonstrated that American methods were at least equally valid. Montgomery could no longer argue that American forces needed British command to succeed against major obstacles. The timing of Patton's crossing was also symbolic. He crossed exactly 1 day before Operation Plunder, just early enough to claim he crossed first, just early enough to steal Montgomery's thunder. The timing was not accidental. Patton understood the political dimensions of the rivalry. He wanted the world to know that American forces could accomplish what Montgomery claimed required months of British planning. The message was clear, and it was devastating to Montgomery's credibility. This brings us back to the fundamental question. Why did Montgomery lose command of 300,000 American soldiers? The simple answer is that he destroyed trust with a press conference and then tried to exploit a temporary arrangement. But the deeper answer is that Montgomery never understood coalition warfare. He viewed the alliance through a lens of national competition rather than cooperation. He saw American forces as resources to be commanded rather than partners to be respected. He measured success by personal glory rather than Allied victory. His January press conference revealed this mindset completely. Montgomery genuinely believed he had saved the American army during the Bulge. He thought stating this publicly was simply sharing facts. He did not understand that claiming credit for American victories would be seen as a betrayal by American soldiers who had done the fighting. He did not anticipate that American generals would react with fury. He did not consider how his words would affect the morale of American troops who had just survived the bloodiest battle in American history. This was not malice. This was a complete failure to understand the political dimensions of coalition command. Montgomery was thinking like a British field marshal commanding British troops. But he was operating within an Allied coalition where national sensitivities mattered enormously. When Montgomery tried to keep Ninth Army permanently after the Rhine crossing, he made the same mistake again. He saw operational logic for keeping the army. He genuinely believed unity of command in the North made military sense, but he did not consider the political impossibility of permanently commanding American forces after breaking trust with American generals. He did not understand that the temporary arrangement was a test of his trustworthiness. He did not recognize that Eisenhower was giving him a chance to prove he could be trusted, and he was failing that test. Eisenhower, by contrast, understood coalition warfare perfectly. He knew that maintaining the alliance was more important than any operational advantage. He knew that respecting national sensitivities was essential to keeping the coalition functioning. He knew that American troops needed to be commanded by American generals not just for military effectiveness, but for political legitimacy. Most importantly, Eisenhower understood that the war would be won by the Allied coalition, not by any individual commander. Montgomery's strategic vision might have been brilliant. His operational plans might have been superior. But none of that mattered if pursuing those plans destroyed the alliance. Eisenhower's genius was recognizing that coalition unity was more valuable than any strategic advantage Montgomery's plans might provide. This is why Eisenhower is remembered as one of the great commanders of the war, while Montgomery, despite his operational successes, is remembered as difficult and self-promoting. Eisenhower won the political war that mattered most. He kept the alliance together. He maintained relationships with Churchill and Roosevelt. He prevented his generals from resigning. He balanced competing national interests. And he did all this while defeating Nazi Germany. Montgomery won battles but lost the political struggle that determined his legacy. So, what can we learn from this crisis? First, trust is everything in coalition operations. Once trust is destroyed, no amount of competence can restore it. Montgomery's January press conference cost him the trust of American commanders. Everything that followed was a consequence of that lost trust. His apology prevented immediate dismissal but did not restore trust. His successful Rhine crossing proved his competence but did not restore trust. Once Bradley and Patton decided Montgomery could not be trusted, his fate was sealed. Second, temporary arrangements in coalitions are tests. When Eisenhower gave Montgomery temporary command of Ninth Army, it was not just an operational necessity. It was a test of whether Montgomery could be trusted to honor agreements. Montgomery failed that test by trying to keep the Army permanently. His failure provided justification for taking all American forces away from his command. Third, operational brilliance without political awareness is insufficient for coalition leadership. Montgomery was operationally competent. His planning for Operation Plunder was excellent. His execution was professional. But he lacked the political awareness necessary to operate effectively within a coalition structure. He did not understand how his actions would be perceived by allies. He did not recognize the importance of national sensitivities. He could not see beyond military logic to the political realities that constrained his options. Fourth, ego destroys more careers than incompetence. Montgomery's downfall was not caused by military failure. Operation Plunder succeeded. His operational plans were sound. His forces performed well. Montgomery's downfall was caused by ego. His need for recognition led him to claim credit that was not his. His confidence in his strategic vision led him to break agreements when they conflicted with his plans. His inability to share glory led him to alienate the allies he needed most. If Montgomery had been humble at his January press conference, none of this would have happened. If he had praised American soldiers instead of claiming personal credit, the crisis would never have occurred. If he had honored his agreement to return Ninth Army after the Rhine crossing, he might have commanded American forces for subsequent operations. But Montgomery's ego made humility impossible. Fifth, the leader who manages relationships wins. Eisenhower was not the most brilliant tactical commander in the Allied coalition. Patton was probably more operationally gifted. Montgomery was certainly more experienced. But Eisenhower understood relationships better than any commander in the war. He maintained his friendship with Churchill despite disagreements. He kept Bradley and Patton loyal despite frustrations. He navigated the political minefields of coalition command while keeping everyone focused on defeating Germany. This is why Eisenhower rose to supreme Allied commander, while more brilliant tactical minds served under his authority. Wars are won by coalitions, and coalitions require leaders who understand people. Now let's talk about what happened after April 4th, when Ninth Army returned to American command. Montgomery's 21st Army Group continued advancing with only British and Canadian forces. They drove into northern Germany and the Netherlands. They liberated Dutch cities that had been under occupation for years. They captured key ports. They accepted the surrender of German forces in their sector. Montgomery commanded these operations successfully. His forces performed professionally. The advance continued until Germany's final surrender on May 8, 1945. But Montgomery was no longer commanding the massive Allied thrust he had envisioned. He was commanding a secondary theater with limited forces. The main American drive into Germany was happening to the south, under Bradley's command. Patton's Third Army was racing across Germany. Simpson's Ninth Army was advancing under American direction. The final victory belonged to American forces using American operational methods. Montgomery had been reduced to a supporting role in the theater where he had wanted to be the decisive commander. The irony is profound. Montgomery had spent years arguing that he should command the main Allied thrust into Germany. He believed his strategic vision was superior. He believed concentrated force in the north would end the war faster. He believed American broad front strategy was wasteful. But when Germany finally surrendered, it was American armies advancing on a broad front that delivered victory. Montgomery's concentrated thrust in the north with limited forces played a supporting role. History did not vindicate Montgomery's strategic vision. Bradley's Ninth Army, the force Montgomery had desperately wanted to keep, linked up with Soviet forces at the Elbe River on April 25, 1945. This meeting between American and Soviet troops symbolized the Allied victory. Germany was cut in half. The Third Reich was finished. The war in Europe was effectively over. This historic moment happened under American command, not British command. The army Montgomery claimed was essential for victory in the North achieved its greatest success after returning to American authority. Simpson and his soldiers accomplished everything Montgomery said they would accomplish, but they did it as part of the American command structure. The symbolism was devastating for Montgomery's argument that American forces needed British leadership to succeed. Then, on May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Allied forces had achieved total victory. The Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. Nazi Germany was destroyed. The Holocaust was ended. Europe was liberated. Victory belonged to the entire Allied coalition. American forces, British forces, Canadian forces, Free French forces, and Soviet forces had all contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany. But the final phase of the war had been dominated by American strength and American command. This was the reality that Churchill had acknowledged in his painful January speech to Parliament. Britain was the junior partner. American forces had done most of the fighting. American logistics had sustained the offensive. American industry had provided the weapons that made victory possible. Montgomery's post-war career reflected his diminished status. He was promoted to Field Marshal and later served as Chief of the Imperial General Staff. He received honors and recognition for his wartime service. But his reputation was complicated by the controversies of 1945. Montgomery published memoirs defending his strategic vision and criticizing Eisenhower's broad front strategy. He maintained that concentrated force in the North would have ended the war sooner. He argued that political considerations had overruled sound military judgment. But historians generally concluded that Eisenhower's approach was correct. The broad front prevented German forces from concentrating against a single thrust. It maintained pressure across the entire front. It reflected the reality that the Allied coalition included multiple national armies that could not all be subordinated to a single concentrated offensive. Montgomery's vision of a decisive thrust to Berlin under his command was strategically questionable and politically impossible. American historians documented the crisis of January 1945 in detail. Bradley's memoirs described his threat to resign. Patton's diaries revealed his contempt for Montgomery. Eisenhower's papers showed the careful political maneuvering required to maintain the alliance. The story of how Montgomery lost 300,000 American soldiers became a case study in coalition warfare and the importance of trust. British historians defended Montgomery's operational competence while acknowledging his political failures. They noted that his January press conference was a disaster. They admitted that his attempt to keep Ninth Army permanently was a mistake, but they argued that Montgomery's strategic vision deserved more respect than it received from American historians. The debate continues to this day. What cannot be debated is the outcome. Montgomery lost command of American forces because he destroyed trust and then tried to exploit a temporary arrangement. Eisenhower outmaneuvered him politically while maintaining the alliance. American operational methods proved effective. The war ended with American armies dominating the final offensive into Germany. There's one final aspect of this story that reveals just how completely Montgomery misunderstood coalition warfare. In his memoirs, Montgomery described the January crisis as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by American sensitivity. He claimed his press conference was simply explaining facts. He maintained that American generals overreacted. He argued that operational logic supported his plans for commanding American forces. This analysis reveals that Montgomery learned nothing from the crisis. He still believed he was right. He still thought American reactions were unreasonable. He still viewed the situation through a lens of operational logic rather than political reality. Montgomery never understood that his press conference was not about facts. It was about respect. American soldiers had fought and died in the Ardennes. American generals had commanded the defense. American sacrifices had stopped the German offensive. When Montgomery claimed personal credit for that victory, he disrespected everyone who had contributed to it. The factual accuracy of his statements was irrelevant. The political impact was what mattered. Montgomery also never understood that his plan to keep American armies permanently was not just an operational question. It was a question of sovereignty and national pride. American forces needed to be commanded by American generals because that's what a sovereign nation requires. The United States was not a junior partner providing troops for British strategic objectives. The United States was the dominant power in the alliance, and American forces would be commanded by Americans. This was not negotiable. Eisenhower understood these realities perfectly. His genius was recognizing that political realities constrained military options. He could not give Montgomery what he wanted because doing so would destroy the American command structure. He could not fire Montgomery because doing so would damage the alliance with Britain. So he found the narrow path that maintained the alliance while protecting American command authority. That is the mark of strategic brilliance at the highest level. Now let me ask you something. How many stories like this exist from World War II? Moments where political decisions shaped military outcomes. Crises that almost destroyed alliances. Personality conflicts that changed the course of history. Most World War II content focuses on battles and military hardware. But the really fascinating stories are about people. Leaders making impossible decisions under enormous pressure. Egos clashing at the highest levels of command. Political maneuvering that determined who won and who lost. This is what happened in January 1945. Montgomery's ego led him to claim credit that wasn't his. That press conference destroyed trust with American commanders. Eisenhower gave Montgomery one last chance with Ninth Army. Montgomery tried to exploit it. He lost everything. The story reveals truths about leadership that extend far beyond World War II. Trust is fragile and essential. Ego destroys more careers than incompetence. Coalition operations require political awareness. Relationships matter more than operational brilliance. Eisenhower understood these truths. Montgomery did not. That's why Eisenhower commanded the coalition that won the war, while Montgomery ended up commanding only British forces in a secondary role. Think about the pressure Eisenhower was under during this crisis. He had generals threatening to resign. He had Churchill demanding concessions for Britain. He had a war to win against Germany. He had to balance competing national interests while maintaining an effective command structure. One wrong move, and the alliance fractures. One mistake, and victory is delayed. Eisenhower made no mistakes. He navigated the crisis perfectly. He punished Montgomery without firing him. He restored American command authority without humiliating Britain. He maintained the alliance while protecting his relationships with American generals. And he did it all while keeping everyone focused on defeating Nazi Germany. That is leadership under pressure at its finest. Montgomery's failure provides equally important lessons. He was operationally competent. His planning was professional. His forces performed well in combat. But he lacked the political awareness necessary to operate within a coalition. His January press conference revealed tone-deaf insensitivity to American sacrifices and pride. His attempt to keep Ninth Army permanently revealed an inability to honor agreements. His entire approach revealed someone who viewed the alliance as a tool for personal glory, rather than a partnership between nations. These failures cost him everything. He went from commanding over 500,000 American soldiers to commanding 0. He went from planning the main Allied thrust into Germany to commanding a secondary theater. He went from being a major player in Allied strategy to being sidelined for the final victory, all because he could not control his ego and could not understand coalition politics. The tragedy is that this was avoidable. If Montgomery had praised American soldiers at his press conference, instead of claiming personal credit, none of this happens. If he had honored his agreement to return Ninth Army after the Rhine crossing, he might have commanded American forces for subsequent operations. If he had shown humility instead of demanding permanent command, Eisenhower might have trusted him with greater authority. But Montgomery could not be humble. His ego would not allow it. And so he destroyed his own career through a series of preventable mistakes driven by pride and self-promotion. This is a cautionary tale for anyone in a leadership position. Your relationships matter more than your competence. Trust is more valuable than operational brilliance. Political awareness is essential for success in complex organizations. And ego will destroy you faster than any external enemy. Montgomery learned these lessons too late. By the time he realized what he had lost, the opportunity was gone. American armies were advancing under American command. Montgomery was relegated to a supporting role. The final victory belonged to forces he no longer commanded, using methods he had criticized. Let's bring this back to where we started. Early January 1945, Eisenhower sat at his desk facing the worst command crisis of the war. His British field marshal had insulted American soldiers. His American generals were threatening resignation. The alliance was fracturing. Now you know how it ended. Montgomery lost 300,000 American soldiers. Eisenhower maintained the alliance. American forces achieved victory using American methods under American command. Britain's role as a major strategic player ended. This story never made it into most history books. The focus is always on battles and military operations, but this political crisis shaped the final phase of the war more than any battle. The command structure that emerged from this crisis determined how victory was achieved. The lessons about trust and coalition warfare remain relevant today. If you found this story fascinating, do me a favor. Leave a comment below telling me what other forgotten stories from World War II you want to hear. There are thousands of moments like this that changed history but never get discussed. Hit that like button if you learned something new today. And subscribe to this channel because we dig into the stories that textbooks ignore. The real history of World War II is not just about battles. It's about people, leaders making impossible decisions, egos clashing at the highest levels, political crises that almost destroyed alliances. This is the history that matters. This is the history that reveals truth about leadership and power and human nature. Montgomery claimed he saved the Americans and lost everything. Eisenhower saved the alliance and won the war. Patton proved American methods worked by crossing the Rhine first. Churchill had to publicly admit Britain was the junior partner. Bradley got his armies back. The story has everything: pride, betrayal, revenge, brilliant political maneuvering, and a press conference that almost lost the war. This is the forgotten history of World War II. and there are hundreds more stories like this waiting to be told. So subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next video where we dive into another moment that changed history but nobody talks about. Thanks for watching.